Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? An interesting thing happened. I made a couple of videos about astonishing swordsmen and sorcerers of Hyperborea, and I had one of my viewers comment and said, "Hey, you should review this other game. It's called Crypts and Things, and it's a swords and sorcery variant of Swords and Wizardry." And so I like, well, yeah, it costs some money, and there's some other things I want to buy first, but it's kind of on my list. Maybe I'll check this thing out. But I look at some other reviews of it. I figure, what the heck, I'll take a look. And it's based on Swords and Wizardry, but it's kind of a Swords and Sorcery version. So they made some changes to the game. But I watched one review, and I'm not gonna. My intent is not to bash the guy that reviewed it, but it was kind of funny because he might have been a little chronologically challenged too, and not experienced some of the older games. But the idea, he was saying that it was cool, but he wished they'd come from a more swords and sorcery point first and use it as a starting point, because in his opinion what it should be like is that there shouldn't be very much magic in the world, but the wizards that are in the world should be ultra powerful, kind of like kings or something. This is kind of like the way storybooks go. So I was thinking about that, and there's ways to do that, of course. But what makes a game Swords and Sorcery? What makes one a role-playing game Swords and Sorcery and another one not? Why is something like this Swords and Sorcery when something like this, see if I can pull it up here, maybe isn't. Maybe this is high fantasy. Maybe this is high fantasy. I'm dropping my books around. I've got too many books. Maybe let's see, where is it? Yeah. maybe this is Swords and Sorcery. What makes one game Swords and Sorcery and another one not? And how do you get that vibe? So none of this is going to be really rocket science or anything, but let's call it, for sake of argument, Swords and Sorcery is a game or a system or a setting, where there's not magic around every corner, where there's not, every village and every town doesn't have a wizard or three. There's not fantastical creatures everywhere. That's more high magic. If your world looks a lot like fantasy novel cover number X, you go to your bookstore and you see the dragons and the elves and the pixies and the sprites and everything. Okay, well, that's high fantasy. That's not Swords and Sorcery. But if your world looks more like this, okay, that's more Swords and Sorcery. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Magic items are rare. Wizards are, or magic users are rare. Magic is strange and crazy. So that's Swords and Sorcery, and the creatures are different. So how do you do that in a game, and what games lend themselves to that, and what games don't? I'll give you, you can play any game Swords and Sorcery. I'll kind of drop my opinion here first. A game like this is more high magic. If you leaf through say something like even BX or what did I just hold up there? Basic fantasy role-playing game. There's elves and there's dwarves and there's halflings and all that kind of stuff, and pixies and sprites and dragons and goblins. That's high fantasy. What makes something like, say, Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea more Swords and Sorcery, or something like Lamentations of the Flame Princess more Swords and Sorcery? Or something like Crypts and Things. I haven't actually made eyeball marks on it, but I got some of the vibe. Part of it is just like, well, let's say we'll take Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers. At first glance, it's like, well, gosh, this is kind of like D&D. It's got a lot of spells in here, and there's a whole bunch of classes and subclasses that are casters. What gives? Is this really Swords and Sorcery? Depends on how you play it. What I like about this particular game is it's got some flavor in there. There's not as many spells as there were, in first edition, and a lot of them kind of have a little bit of a flavor to them. Not as many monsters. There's some cool ones. Look at that. So you know what that is. There's some cool ones here, but if you're flipping through this, the bestiary in this particular game kind of has a feel to it. A lot of the monsters are missing. There's not dragons. There's not goblins. There's not the sprites and pixies and all that stuff. There's a lot of giant animals, but that kind of goes with the vibe. That these things are normal creatures, but not really. So every once in a while, Conan or his friends or whoever, go into the wilderness and they encounter giant hyenas or giant, something, giant bears. More of your monsters are things like, snake men. And it kind of has that kind of vibe. You've got humans in the game. You don't play with dwarves and elves and halflings. Even if you're playing D&D, even if you're playing basic fantasy role-playing game, or, you say, okay, we're not going to use those races. For the most part, I know in Lamentations of the Flame Princess, James Raggi, he included those races because he wanted to make it kind of compatible. At least that's the story I got. But he doesn't play with, the other elves and dwarves, and neither did we when we played that game, you know. And I'm not planning to again as far as player characters, and they might not exist in the world at all. So that's kind of more of a swords and sorcery vibe. So it's like, you know, that game doesn't even have a bestiary, and you know the way the spells are written. There, you know, part of the swords and sorcery vibe too is kind of like this idea that there's, you know, there's men, and then there's this cosmic weirdness. And things that are just kind of like, you know, black magic almost, and unusual. So how do you, you know, one of the other things that I really dig about something like Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers, that's a long name, of Hyperborea, is you got this class here. You've got our, this is a priest. He's a cleric, but he only has D4 hit dice, and he doesn't have very good attack bonuses, so he's kind of like a wizard, but he gets a lot more cleric spells. And here's a cool thing. I love this piece of flavor in the game. At 9th level, a priest can do something called Demon Rack, which, if you know first edition D&D, it's Spirit Rack. That's the only class that gets to do it, to actually kind of bind a demon. And that's some great flavor. So what are you doing in a game like, say, that, you know, Astonishing Swordsman and Sorcerers of Hyperborea, or Lamentations of the Flame Princess? How do you make it more swords and sorcery, or even something like straight up D&D? Well, first of all, you know, you don't have a wizard in every town. Maybe hardly have any. Maybe you know, if your players are going to play a caster, if they're allowed to, because you can go the way that we're just not. You guys aren't going to play any spellcasters at all, which is another kind of variant. But maybe, you know, if you're a PC spellcaster, maybe you really need to keep this under wraps. There's not a Hogwarts, you know, that someplace, and you know, people know that, you know, people go to wizard school. There's not hedge mages. It's scary. People are going to be superstitious. You don't want to like kind of tip your hand that that's the kind of person you are. And, you know, you can look like just everybody else in the party, because, you know, honestly, you know, a guy walking around in plate mail looks pretty freaking weird too. So, you know, maybe you guys are kind of wearing a little bit less. But, you know, that sort of idea. You don't have to wear a pointed hat and advertise, you know, what you are. Even things like priests or clerics or whatnot, you know, or shamans, you know, that they have in that game. You can certainly make, you know, a cleric a shaman in something like Lamentations or any other D&D variant. It's called a shaman. You know, maybe the idea that these people cast spells, that maybe that's under wraps. Maybe, you know, you're a cleric or shaman of a cult, or something that, you know, is kind of frowned on by the general populace. So that kind of makes it swords and sorcery as well. The idea that you can only, you know, play something like fighters and thieves, also, that makes it very swords and sorcery. And to get back to what that reviewer of Crypts and Things was talking about, you know, if you want to go with that vibe that, you know, the casters in the world, the sorcerers in the world are just these ultra powerful guys, well, then don't have PC casters and have them be really powerful. You know, have at it. Figure out what you want to do. And if you do have PC casters, maybe these NPC wizards, you know, the evil dark guy, well, you know, you don't use the rules. You don't figure out what level he is. You just give him a bunch of spells and abilities and make him pretty powerful and pretty badass. You know, you can have at it that way. You know, what makes the game swords and sorcery in the end is that. It's up to the DM. How am I going to make this swords and sorcery? You know, how are you going to control the monsters? How are you going to control the magic items? You know, this game, I don't want to say the name anymore. This game has a lot of magic items in the referee's guide, and a lot of them are very, you know, first edition-y, you know, standard stuff, and some stuff he's kind of retooled and whatnot. You don't have to have them everywhere. You play a swords and sorcery game, they're rare, they're unusual. You know, James Raggy talked about the idea that, like, you throw out the idea of a +1 sword. If there's a sword, you know, it's like Stormbringer. It's something special. It's a named sword. Maybe this is an intelligent sword. It's a thing. And if you got creatures that can only be harmed by magic weapons, you change it. You know, if you don't have a lot of that stuff in your game, okay, well, maybe they only take half damage from normal weapons. Maybe silver weapons do a thing. Maybe it's cold iron. Maybe if you do have that magic sword, it's something really special. But, you know, you just alter the way the monsters work. You know, there's ways around all that. There's ways around healing, too. I think this game actually, I believe it's this game, does a great thing. Yeah, there it is. There's the guy. Oh, there he is. This game does a great thing with healing where, like, you know, when you take a night's rest, you heal your hit die. So if you're a fighter, you heal D10 hit points. You know, if you're a magic user, you only heal D4 because you probably don't have that many hit points to begin with. And I've even toyed around with the idea, well, maybe like every 2 levels in whatever game I use, the idea that maybe, you know, you heal that many hit dice. So if you're a 4th level fighter, maybe you roll 2d8. You know, if you use d8 hit dice for fighters, and okay, you heal that many hit points. You're a cleric, you use d6. Okay, you know, you're 4th level cleric. Okay, you know, roll 2d6. That's how many hit points you heal. So there's ways around it. Oh, well, cleric, yeah, he's a healer. Let's go with somebody else. Maybe go with a thief. But you get the idea. There's ways around it, so you can make any game, Swords and Sorcery. But some games, are just written in a way, like Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea and Lamentations of the Flame Princess. They're written in such a way they kind of support that. And I'm sure Crypts and Things is written the same way. I'll have to look at it at some point. But Swords and Sorcery is up to you. Do you want high magic, high fantasy? Or do you want down and dirty, gritty, pulp fiction, Swords and Sorcery, low magic? It's all in how you as a game master, run your world. Both are great. Which do you want?